So, welcome to this episode of Listening to the Land, brought to you by the Real Farming Trust and Animate Earth. And my name is Rachel Fleming. I am here today with Manda Scott and Colin Campbell, and we're going to be talking about how traditional indigenous knowledge systems can inform us about how we listen to the land. So, Manda Scott, I'm sure many of you will know, is a wonderful author. He wrote the Boudica Dreaming books, and her recent novel, Any Human Power, is a look at how we might transition to a through-topia. Well, it's through-topia. You can explain a bit more about that, Amanda. A through-topia novel of how to get from here to something different that kind of supports thriving life for all. She's also the founder of Accidental Gods and does magnificent podcasts. Again, you can talk about that a bit later, Amanda. So we also have Colin Campbell, who is a lineage holder of one of the African traditional indigenous systems. He works and teaches with Animate Earth. He is a traditional diviner, and he is really interested in how we can bring some of these traditions into modern culture. So, welcome to both of you. It's lovely to see you today. I would love to come to you first, Colin, then. Traditional indigenous knowledge systems. We're interested in listening to the land so that we may become better stewards, farmers, growers upon it. We want to look at this reciprocal relationship between us and the land. So, how do you think these kind of traditional knowledges can help us?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for inviting me onto this podcast. It's an honor to be here. And I think the place I would want to start is, what we tend to do is differentiate between who we are in this modern time and so-called traditional indigenous knowledge. What I would want to say is that I don't think there really is a differentiation. Traditional indigenous knowledge exists in all of us. We all come from a history that is ancient, and that still somehow resides in us. And that knowledge, I believe, exists in us now, and that it's an innate knowledge, and it's a knowledge that emerges as we engage with relating. And the more open we are to that engagement, the more that knowledge emerges within us. That doesn't mean that there aren't others out there, different cultural systems and so on, that are not valuable in terms of we can go and ask them and speak to them and learn from them and so on. But in the end, for me, it's more about how we begin to include parts of ourselves that I think we've occluded in our modern time. And I think that it's a relatively practical thing. In other words, when we go back into nature and we go with a willingness to genuinely relate. In other words, we to some extent divest ourselves of the tendency we presently have to kind of try and barricade ourselves against nature accessing us, and therefore also ourselves against accessing nature. In other words, we close out our capacity for deep relating. So if we go out into nature and we are willing to do that, then what naturally begins to bubble up is relating, because relating is a natural thing. It's not something we actually have to learn. It's more something we have to remember in those areas where we've closed relationship out. It's an innate capacity within us. And yes, we can go and speak to, for example, traditional people who still have a very deep ongoing relationship with nature and ask them what they do. And they might say to you, well, we go and we sit on mountains and by rivers and we do things in nature, and we do things with nature, and we have this way of relating to nature, and we can even begin to emulate some of those practices, recognizing that when we are doing that, we're not so much taking on a new practice as remembering a practice that we have almost certainly done in our ancestry somewhere along the line. So for me, it's a recollecting and it's a remembering and it's a reinvigorating of those parts of relatedness which we have closed out. And in doing that, so listening becomes more a deeply embedded relational process. So we're not simply going onto land and seemingly opening our ears and saying, well, what do you have to say to me? We're going out into nature and into the natural world and onto land and we're saying, I'm here and I'm open and I deeply desire to relate and to in all the different ways and the dimensions that relationship involves, and that's multiplicit. So and in that process, if we continue to do it, we begin to resensitize ourselves because the areas of relating that we have occluded become desensitized, and to that extent, we even forget they exist. And so there are ways of relating that is inherently part of our history, that is part of who we are, that is innate to who we are, that we've simply forgotten. And that in going back into the natural world with a willingness to sensitize ourselves potentially to those, it automatically starts happening. And that's what I would call, I suppose, listening in the biggest sense of what listening, because then interchange starts happening, a dialogue starts happening, and that dialogue is not merely verbal, heard with the ears or even seen necessarily only with the eyes. It's a co-immersiveness, and out of that comes a mutual space, and out of that mutual space comes deep relatedness, and then there is a mutual hearing in the biggest sense of what that word means.
Wonderful. Thank you, Colin. So when we think about remembering then, Manda, what I really loved about your Boudica books was that it seemed to be a remembrance of how things were in these islands then, in those times when actually we did have that relational aspect to how we were with the land. I'm interested to, where that came from, what your feelings were about that, whether that's something you practice in your life. Yeah,
Thank
how does
you.
that land with you?
Thank you. And I just would like to echo Colin, say it's an honor to be here and to share this space with both of you, two of the wisdom keepers of our time. It's really important. Thank you. So, so the first thing to say about the Boudica books is it's over 20 years since I wrote them. I started writing them at the very end of the old millennium, 1999. So who I was then and who I am now is different. My understanding is different. They arose out of my own spiritual practice, out of a particular significant event that pushed me out of what I thought I was writing into what I felt the web of life needed me to write and wanted me to write and would support me to write. And that turned out, certainly the support was there in huge amounts. And they were based on my core belief that we are waking up from the post-Roman nightmare, that capitalism, the predatory death cult that we live in at the moment, is a product of the same thinking that the Romans brought to the islands of Britain, where what ownership of people is a thing, what matters is gaining value in the form of money, but basically gaining power, and that the people who gain power have a right to hold that power and to own people and the more than human world in a subject relationship. And I believed, and I still believe, that here in the islands of Britain, that mindset had not taken root until the colonization by Rome. And that prior to that, we had a different mindset, which was one of reciprocity and relationship, exactly what Colin was talking about. That knowing ourselves to be an integral part of the greater web of life, and that each of us then has a role within that web, that each of us does what is ours to do, what only we can do, what we can do best, surrounded by other nodes in the web, some of which are human, many of which are not, where every aspect of the web is striving to do what it can within a psychospiritual and practical emergent process. Rome did not invent this. They just happened to be very, very good at exporting it around what was then the known world. So everywhere from Egypt through to the boundary between England and Scotland, which was a bit variable. Basically, Hadrian's Wall was a northern boundary, and then out towards India and up into Scandinavia. That mindset then took hold, and it feels to me there's an old story in what Turtle Island, what the native people called Turtle Island, and we called the United States of America, currently shifting from colonial to probably techno-feudal, who knows? And the story was of the Wetigo or the Wendigo, which was an entity that could infest people, and then it was a very frightening thing. You know, do as we say or the Wetigo will come was possibly the kind of narrative you would tell your kids, but I don't actually think frightening children was a thing. But the concept of the Wetigo, for instance, if a hunting party was caught away in the snow and couldn't get back to the people, and some survived by cannibalism, they potentially would come back infected with the Wetigo, which was infectious. And there were very elaborate, quite prolonged rituals to help heal that person and return them to the tribe. And it was one of those things that was spoken of, but probably didn't happen very often. Until white people arrived on the land, and here's an entire culture that is Wetigo, and against which we don't really have defenses, because if you have scruples, if you have ethics, if you have morals, if you have a sense of reciprocity and relationship and responsibility with the web of life, you treat it very differently than the people who are basically in a mindset that says see, want, take, extract, consume, destroy, pollute. And it's as we've seen, then colonialism wipes out those who care. There was a 99% annihilation of the people of that continent by the invading forces. And similar around the world, it's not limited to there. So, but what happens if we here, who have been domesticated into that mindset, choose to wake up from the post-Roman nightmare, basically, or choose to wake up into our connection with the web of life? And I think we are born expecting to come into a whole and healed culture. Every little newborn has 64 million years of evolution since the last mass extinction, and billions of years since we were hydrogen boiling in the sun, of this is who I am. I come as a miracle of life, expecting connection and reciprocity and relationship, expecting to be held in that amazing web of life, of spiritual and emotional and physical connectedness. And our culture, quotes, civilizes us, domesticates us by breaking those. But we are born with that expectation. It is our birthright. And as Colin has so eloquently said, we can reconnect. And I think knowing that it is possible is the first step to beginning to include what we occlude. I love that, Colin. It's a really good concept. Reconnection is not only possible, I think it is now essential. And in doing so, we free up our head minds, the part of us that tells us we're separate, that also tells us we have to know the answers to everything. We have to plan a way forward. We have to know how to make tomorrow safe. And instead, we come to our heart mind and asking the web of life, what do you want of me? And responding in real time, in a sense where I am a part of a greater whole. I am connected. And I think each of us yearns for that connection. And once it begins to happen, the little threads of it, it's so exciting and so enriching and so enlivening. And knowing that this is possible is what takes us forward, I think. Does that ask the question you actually asked?
Yeah. And I'm also interested to kind of ask you how much then of the kind of how possible is it for us to remember how to do that now, and how important is it for us to go back to the old stories, myths, traditions of the land that we're on? Where is that balance? You know, isn't it important to kind of look at these fragments of what we've still got left?
I don't know. I think I don't know because I did immerse myself in those fragments and now I am where I am. And so what would life be like if I hadn't? I think knowing it's possible is what matters. And for each of us to go there, you go out and you ask the land and it tells you what you need to know. I don't think it gets more complicated than that. And I think it's really important that we move forward. I meet a lot of people who get obsessed with past life work and I think, and I get quite worried about that because actually we're here to live now. What matters is living in the moment and learning from the land. And if the land says you need to understand historical stuff, that's fine. But I think it's possible to get caught up in a lot of projection of what we think was happening 2000 years ago. And we can't prove it. And we're looking back. And I think we need to look forward. But if looking back helps us to look forward, then I'm not going to stop anybody. But the absolute bottom line is we need to get out and we need to ask the land. And finding whatever tools work for each of us is critical. But if we get hooked up in our head mind, then it's very easy to create processes and ceremonies and things that we tell ourselves have some kind of deep historical basis. And we can become, parts of ourselves can become quite fixed in that belief system. And I think letting go of belief systems in order to be free to hear what is really matters. Donella Meadows, who was an absolute genius of systems thinking, created her 12 levers of change. And the top one is abandon all paradigms. And that's really hard because you have to let go of the bit that tells you need to let go. It's quite a difficult, potentially reinforcing downward spiral if you're not careful, but letting go to listen matters more than anything else, I think. But if finding structures from the past help you, then definitely go for it.
Great. And if I can ask you one more question before I move back to Colin, do you think, so going back to this idea that newborns are kind of coming ready to connect with the web of life, do you think that we all have this kind of within us to do? Do you think some are particularly gifted here? Do you think that some kind of avenues of work, and I'm thinking particularly of people that work with the land, seem to kind of have more of an understanding of what this relationship looks like. Do you think it's possible for any of us to develop it, or do we have to kind of be gifted and
It's
from the
possible for any of us to develop this. I absolutely believe that. And it seems to me, and perhaps Colin can speak to this, that the web of life is pressing closer, is offering urgency and agency more than it was, but it may be that I am becoming more urgent. So I don't know if it's the web or if it's me. It's a reciprocal relationship, and it's hard then to unweave the weave and see what's mine and what's comes from everything else. Absolutely, every single one of us has the capacity for this. Some people come to it more effortlessly, and in other cultures and other ways of being, they would probably be the people who became the spokespersons for the web of life, because that is a thing. But every single one of us can do this. The web is not going to not speak to somebody because they didn't, they're not the seventh daughter or a seventh daughter. That's not a thing. Anyone can do it. And I think, and for me, it is the single most urgent focus of our lives now. I think healing ourselves so that the frozen parts that can't hear become thawed and become mobile is super important. Healing the relationships between all parts of ourselves, between ourselves and each other, between ourselves and the web, is the work of now, because the more we thaw, the more fluid we become, the more we are able to hear. And some people carry more frozen parts inside than others, and there's nothing we can do about that. But for each of us to heal and thaw and become fluid and become open is the work of now, and we definitely can all do it.
Brilliant, thank you. So, Colin, coming over to you then, I've heard you say fairly recently that you feel as though this is a moment where nature kind of is reaching out to us. You know, it feels like we're in this what do we do now moment, but perhaps there's an opportunity here. I'm wondering if you think that is the case still.
Um, yes, I do. Well, I think nature's always been reaching out to us because we do have, essentially, we are of nature and we have an inherent nature relationship with nature. Um, and I think that, we're being called constantly into relating. And I think the relationship, we're born into relationship. We're born with relationship. Perhaps we're born from and into relationship. But the task of the child is to turn an existential sense of relatedness into a corporal sense of relatedness. How do we as an individual, as a human being incarnate on earth in a physical world, how do we practice relationship? And therein is a cultivation. And of course, we learn that through our cultural framing. We learn that through modeling others. But at the underneath that is an inherent sense of relationship within us, which is something we know. So what I do think is happening at the moment is perhaps less that nature is reaching out to us in any greater sense than it ever has, and more that we're coming to realizations as human beings. We're realizing, we're realizing what we've cut out, what we've lost, what we've, well, not so much lost, but what we've, well, occluded from our experience. And we're beginning to realize that there are those areas which have become desensitized. And I think I completely agree with Amanda. In the first instance, it's a realization that reestablishing those relationships, regaining them, is indeed possible. And we might not quite know what they are at this stage because of the desensitization. But the moment we go with an attitude of belief at some level that it's possible, that indeed it's possible for all of us, for absolutely every last one of us, because we are all relational beings, then things begin to happen. We begin to open ourselves to things that we would otherwise have been unaware of. We open ourselves to the ways in which indeed nature is continuously reaching out to us. It's not that it hasn't been, it's that we have desensitized ourselves to recognizing that. So part of it is going with the sense of possibility and then cultivating within that sense of possibility the innate sense of a trust in relatedness, because the two go together. So the more we avail ourselves, the more we find ourselves sinking into relationship, the more trust begins to emerge. And the more trust begins to emerge, the more relatedness begins to emerge. And so the two feed each other. And this is possible for absolutely all of us across the board. There's no exception to that. It's innately natural for us. And I think we're realizing that. I think we're realizing that in a way, we're waking up to that possibility. And the other thing about that is important about this is that this is not something that we need to go out and attain. It's something we're already in, we just don't realize it. And so it's really more just it could even be an instantaneous realization, but in general, it takes a bit longer to resensitize ourselves to these things. So we go out and we put ourselves in circumstances which promote a sense of relating. And that's where the practice comes in. But essentially, we're not acquiring anything that hasn't always been there. We're just remembering and realizing that it's there in the first place and waking up to it.
So I guess one of the big differences about your traditional framework and what we have here in these islands today is that young people in a rite of passage to adulthood would have gone out and experienced that relationality directly. That was part of growing up, was to understand that relationship with nature, with the wild. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, well, I think one of the unprecedentednesses of being modern human is the degree to which we've encapsulated ourselves seemingly away from the natural world, from rivers and mountains and free-flowing streams and so on. And this has created a strange kind of bubble in which we exist, and I think that is unprecedented. So I don't think we have to go back that far in the history of being human to find that that wasn't true. We were always in nature. We were always close to it in some way or other. And yes, we've progressively moved away from that through our history. But what is true about that is that in the past, almost everything we did would have been in the context of nature. That is, we would go to a river, we would go to just to collect water to drink, for example, and there would have been a way in which that happened, which had a relational basis to it, a relationship with the river, a relationship with the water itself, a relationship with the practice of going and collecting water, and so on. So there was an innate immersion in the natural world, and the further back we go, the more true that probably is. Um, so rites of passage really were community sanctioned ways, essentially, of moving from one frame of reference to another. In the case you speak of moving from being a so-called child to being a so-called adult. Things change, expectations change, the nature of how your community recognizes you changes, and your community responds to that, and identifies you within that. And that's the primary reason. But what's really important is that that transition takes place in nature, and nature is a fundamental mediator of that transition. And so that relationship is a primary component of that process. And that's what's really important in the relationship with nature itself.
I can't help thinking that if these kind of rites of passage were still available to us in the modern world where we're kind of bubbled away from nature, then at least if we still had those rites of passage which reminded us that there was something behind the bubble, that we wouldn't be in the position we are in now.
Well, certainly many believe that, and I think there may be truth in that. It's hard to know given where we are now. There are a lot of conditions that need to exist for a rite of passage to really do what it's supposed to do. And the biggest part of that is communal sanction. In other words, I can go through, a host of initiatory processes, initiation rites of passage, but if my community doesn't recognize them, they're almost worthless. And who is my community? Of course, that's the rest of the human world that I live in, but it's also the great community, nature herself. So when we go through rites of passage, there's an entirety of interaction that takes place within that process, where recognition, where I find myself seated within a recognized place of having changed. And definitely, I think, we are, well, I believe we're called in some way to reinstate these particular community sanctioned rites of passage, and they need to be community sanctioned at the human level, which means as I leave and come back into my human community, there needs to be a recognition and acknowledgement and an acceptance of that. But it also needs to be recognized by the greater natural world within which I exist, and that requires me to go out into nature and to, in a relational way, work with these transitions in the context of nature, and recognizing that nature has its say in that process as well. And that's not something that's particularly easy for us in our Western particular in the kind of modern way that we find ourselves to accept or understand. That's I think that's a little way down the line in terms of our restoration of our relational processes.
Thank you, Colin. Restoration of our relational processes, Manda. What does that look like to you?
Wow, that's a very big question. So I think a lot of it is about letting go of the need to control, which is really hard in our culture. We do stuff because we can see an outcome. I had a very long conversation yesterday with Daniel Firth Griffith, who farms in Eastern Virginia in the US. He's of white origin, but he's moved beyond regenerative farming to what he calls kin-centric farming, actually kin-centric rewilding. And he's abandoned the concept of harvest. So he's not farming in an outcome dependent way. He is asking the land and the animals. He has a lot of cattle, sheep, goats, horses on 400 acres. And he does harvest the cattle and the sheep and the goats. The horses are for horse logging. But he does it in a way where he's much more integrally part of the land. And how do we get into that? We live in such a target-oriented way of being. I will do a rite of passage and then I will become connected to the land. What happens if I just go and sit on the land and don't have that sense of I am doing this in order to achieve a result that I have preordained? So I think letting go of that, letting go, so that we just, I am here. What do you need of me? And even that in itself is you will need something and then I will do it mindset. But how do I let go of that? And unpicking the need for outcomes is one of those things that's really easy on a head mind basis, in the same way that we can say, I know I need to reconnect with the web of life. Actually being it, so it's in the marrow of my bones, so that it's in the fibers of my tendons, so it's in the soul of who I am, is harder, but I don't think it's impossible. Colin has kind of mapped out the fact that this can be done, but it's done in a way where I am ceding agency, or I'm ceding authority maybe, or I'm ceding direction to the web of life. Ceding as in C-E-D-I-N-G, not S-E-E-D-I-N-G, but it probably comes down to the same thing. I am giving that to the web. I am offering myself in service to life without the anticipation that then I will get something. It's the opposite mindset of the manifesting that is so prevalent in parts of our culture of I will set human intent and then I will get a private jet, or I will win the lottery, or I will have a bigger house, or I will get stuff. And human intention is incredibly powerful, and it's there are people in the world who will set their intention and get their private jet. What happens if I set my intention to be in service with life instead, without nailing the outcomes? I think that's really important now. I think it's actually critical to our survival as a species. But we can do it. That's the thing.
Can you give us a kind of idea of how that works for you? So you're a writer and so many different things, Manda, but you're also a smallholder. How does that look like? How do you do that translation from what you've just spoken and how you work on your land?
Yeah, and how do you do it in parallel with the laws of the land? We had our organic certification, visit yesterday, and we've just been told we have to shut the chickens up because bird flu. And the organic certification's fine. The person who comes is really nice and we get on really well. But shutting the chickens up, that's just too horrible for words. And it's, there are, in North Shropshire, the county that I'm in, there are chicken sheds with 1 million chickens in that have got bird flu. And so because they have bird flu, we have to shut our chickens up. It's an hour's drive. 1 million chickens in a shed needs not to be a thing. And it's only a thing because within the predatory capital death cult, people will buy the product of that without questioning. I did a podcast with Rob Percival, who wrote The Meat Paradox, which is well worth reading. And I got to the end of it and said, Rob, if we only do one thing, what do you do? And he said, stop eating chicken. Just stop. Because it needs not to be a thing. That there are houses with 1 million chickens in. It's obscene on every level. So, that's an aside, but it's an important thing. Each of us contributes to the continuation of the system in which we are, and how can we step back So if you only do one thing at the end of this podcast, stop eating chicken. Actually, the Million House is an egg production facility. Do not eat eggs that come out of that. I don't care how they label them. They may tell you that they're free range. They're not. There's a million chickens in a house. Just don't eat that. Make it not viable within the existing system. That's really important. Leaving that aside, how do we become kin-centric with our land? This is an ongoing process for me. We have 28 acres. I can't let the horses roam in the way that Daniel Firth Griffith does. He has divided his land into 100 acre sections, and he lets them choose where they want to be. He doesn't do mob grazing, but he marks where the cattle choose to rest every morning and every night, and he sees them move themselves on. It's a really interesting process. On 28 acres, I do what I can to help the land, to support the land. I go and sit on the land and ask, what do you want of me? Because even I want this to sequester more carbon, contain more water, increase biodiversity, is outcome based. I am treating the land as if I own it. And this sense of enslavement of the web of life is what our culture has rested on for 10, 12,000 years. And it needs to stop. So I am in an incredibly privileged position of I don't have to make money this way. I can go and sit in the land and say, what do you want? And it's things like fill in the cattle grid so that nothing falls into it and dies. So, okay, we can do that. And it's not always obvious. And some of it we just can't do. I would love to just open the gates and let the ponies roam on the hill, but they would die on the roads within a day. And so I can't do that, or at least I haven't ever risked it. They got out once. It was a very exciting morning. So what can we do? And the honest answer is I don't know fully, because I think there needs to be more of us. So how do I build relationship with the people locally who are still sheep wrecking the land, frankly? You know, how many sheep can I stock on this land until the grass is a millimetre long forever, and there is no biodiversity, and then I ship the sheep 100 miles into the city, and it's all horrible. But how can I talk to people in a way that doesn't create emotional boundaries and doesn't create defensiveness? And that's a learned process in itself. So asking of the land, what do you need of me now, isn't always land related. It might be write a book, write this book, or apply for this grant because you need to be getting utopian ideas out. I wake every morning and I ask, what do you want of me? And I do my absolute utmost to hear the answer. And some of it is land-based and some of it is more social communal on the basis that we now have communities of place, of where I live and where I can speak to people in the street. And we have communities of passion and of purpose, which for a lot of us are online. And we live in the 21st century, and these communities matter. I have people that I have only ever met on Zoom and in other ways of speaking. I've never met flesh to flesh, breathing the same air, and they matter to me a lot, and I can share ideas with them. And I think extending those communities matters also. And then there's a wider community of spirit. And I think cultivating those connections matters also. Of these are the guides that I work with, and showing up for them, not just when I need them, also is really important. Does that answer the question you asked? I feel I'm going down occasional rabbit holes.
That's fine. No, we're enjoying the rabbit holes. So, Colin, if I could come back to you finally, then, just to ask you how you navigate our times, then, finding this balance between the system that we have and the system really that you grew up with in Botswana, which was very, very, very different. You know, how do you walk that line? And I know because I work with you regularly, it's not an easy line to go down, but could you just give us an idea of how you deal with it?
No, for sure. It definitely isn't. And for me, it's a continuing grapple, I would say. I think, I mean, there's a deep schism in me, which is a part of me that grew up in a particular way, in a particular place, in a particular time, with a particular way of relating. And a part of me that is very, very deeply, and always has been at the same time, deeply immersed in our modernity and what being a modern human means, flying around on airplanes and traveling a lot, and living the life of a modern person. And how do I reconcile these two parts of myself? And at some level, I think in the end, what I've come to is that there isn't really a reconciliation between the two, and that's okay. They are two distinct parts of me. They are perhaps even two distinct parts of our nature. We've evolved to become who we've become now, and in doing that, we've also moved away from and perhaps even abandoned a lot of who we are. And we can begin to identify those parts, and the task then is to, in a sense, bring them into some kind of commune, recognizing that they'll probably always be disparate. I don't think it's going to ever be a case where they're all entirely integrated, and so that's a recognition I've come to within myself. And I think, as humans, we're imaginal creatures, and so it's always useful to have images to work with when we're contemplating these things. So, if we recognize that there are, I see that as essentially we have four primary parts to our nature. We have the part of our nature that is imaginative. We have the part of our nature that is willful. We have the part of our nature that is connective. And we have the part of our nature that is sacrificial. And all of those parts of our nature need to be fully cultivated as part of whatever we're doing. And I think what tends to happen, and perhaps this is true of all cultures, I'm not sure, but certainly in our culture, there's a tendency to cultivate particularly one quality over all the others, and perhaps two. We cultivate our willful nature, and we're taught to be willful. We're taught that competitiveness and overcoming and presiding and all these things are the right thing. And so we cultivate that. We also do cultivate our imaginative nature as well. But what we're not good at cultivating in these modern times is our connective nature, and we're more particularly not good at cultivating our sacrificial nature. So if we understand, or if we think about the notion of the sacrificial nature, I see that as the self with the capital S. Now, it comes as a bit of a shock when we think, but hang on, is the self a sacrificial component? Well, yes, I think it is. And that's where I think the biggest work, certainly for myself and perhaps for all of us in modernity, lies in the sense of turning around, because for us, what has been inculcated within us, given that the predominant focus is on the willful nature, is that we cultivate the sense of self to preside over. And it's in that place that we find ourselves believing that we can own land, and that we can decide to have 1 million chickens in a coop, and that we can, that we can do these things, and that somehow we're entitled to that as human beings. This is a distortion of the sacrificial nature of the self with a capital S. So that, I believe, we really have to renegotiate that within ourselves at a very core level. And that's probably one of the most difficult things we're faced with doing. Because the sacrificial nature simply says, I'm here to serve the whole. I'm here to be a functional serving component of the whole. And I'm doing that innately. I'm producing carbon dioxide, which other creatures use, and I'm producing there's a whole way in which the symbiosis potentially of my biophysiology is feeding into and benefiting everything around me. Well, that needs to be brought right into the heart of our sense of self-consciousness, I think. And from there, a genuine, full-fledged symbiosis can begin to happen. And what that brings into line is our creativity, our willfulness, and our connectiveness, which are, in the end, in service to the self with a capital S, which is sacrificial.
I'm glad you explained what you meant by sacrificial there, Colin. My mind was going all over the place, but particularly to be in service to the whole. And I wonder if our kind of take home message, as well as don't eat chicken or eggs from the million chicken coop, to really consider how we can be in service to the whole. So this idea of going out onto the land and saying, how can I be in service? I love that you say that you do that every morning, Manda. That sounds like a beautiful place to leave it, really. Any last thoughts, any bubblings up that you'd like to mention before we go?
For me, I think Colin said it so beautifully. I'm really intrigued about the four aspects of self and would like to learn more. But I think everyone can do this, offering ourselves in service to life, however we frame that, and creating the stillness inside for that to happen, which takes time. We need to, in a world where our time is being strip mined for profit, we need to somehow create the space and the time to be still and to let all the parts of ourselves that are chattering just take a step back and give space to hear or feel or sense whatever is there. But everyone can do it, and it's urgent. Now is the time, we are the people. Maybe a cliche, but it's true.